Last year, Florida's weed market did roughly $1.7 billion, and sitting at the top of that market is Trulieve and Kim Rivers. Trulieve was the first licensed dispensary in Florida, the first dispensary to open, the first name on the list, and pretty much the first for everything. But how did Kim Rivers do this? The American dream, obviously. Social climbing, corruption, and bribery. And of course, the Bonnie to her Clyde, Jason Burnette. Her boyfriend back then and her husband now, whose construction company helped build the early Trulieve footprint in the Florida medical market. The guy who ended up doing 3 years in prison after a public corruption trial. And yes, the very same guy that the FBI caught on tape talking about rigging Florida cannabis legislation that turned what voters approved into a closed-door, licensed game. Most recently, Forbes dropped a glowing article on Kim Rivers calling her the cannabis industry's Trump whisperer, because now she's in the Oval Office helping Donald Trump reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, which also happens to give Trulieve a massive federal tax break. So this is the story of how Florida's medical marijuana market actually came to be, and how it is actually ran by one company or woman. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, all of this is allegedly. Before this was a billion-dollar weed company, it was a Tallahassee story, when the Florida cannabis rules were being written. Insiders were already busy rigging the system. During the federal corruption trial of Tallahassee developer J.T. Burnette, who later married Trulieve CEO Kim Rivers, undercover FBI recordings captured Burnette bragging that he worked with his friend then Rep. Halsey Bashir to insert little tweaks and barriers to entry into Florida early cannabis law. Those tweaks limited eligibility for licenses to a handful of large politically connected nurseries tied into their network. Burnette told undercover agents he didn't know anything about cannabis besides the fact it was profitable. Prosecutors and reporters on the trial said those barriers were designed to make a tight circle of insiders and their allies first in line. Burnette was eventually convicted on multiple federal public corruption charges, including bribery and honest services fraud. He was later sentenced to prison with a large financial penalty. Coverage of this case notes that he talked about helping secure one of the first licenses for what became Trulieve, and that a construction firm connected to him received over $100 million in work from Trulieve within a few years. Prosecutors like to stress that Trulieve itself was never charged with the crime, but when the guy who literally is talking about barriers to entry on tape ends up so financially and physically intertwined to a first wave winner, it makes you wonder what's going on there. Well, we all really know what's going on there. From day one, this program was built around insider access and protection. Now, some might say this is where the real story starts. Let's get into my claim that this was all set up from the beginning to be this way forever. And to do that, we need to go back to 2016 when Amendment 2 was passed. Amendment 2 defines medical marijuana treatment centers as entities that may acquire, cultivate, possess, process, transfer, transport, sell, distribute, or, big emphasis on or, administer medical marijuana. Voters were told that dispensaries had a choice on whether they wanted to process, dispense, grow, etc. That's not quite what happened. The statute defined MMTCs as an entity licensed by the department to cultivate, process, transport, and dispense marijuana for medical use. You don't just get to grow, you don't just get to process, you have to do everything yourself from seed to sale. On top of that, SB 8A tied license caps to patient thresholds at every step of the way. Now, this would have been said and done, but enter would-be MMTC operator Floragrown. Floragrown argued that forcing MMTCs to perform all functions and strictly capping license numbers materially alters, restricts, and contradicts the Amendment 2 definition. When taken to court, Leon County Circuit Judge Charles Dodson agreed and wrote "and" language in the statute contradicts the amendment's text. He ordered the state to start registering more MMTCs in a way that actually aligned with the constitutional language, not adding more restrictions from lawmakers. But while all this was playing out in court, SB 8A silently moved through the House and Senate and passed with large bipartisan numbers. The Department of Health then appealed Dodson's ruling in Florida Department of Health versus Floragrown. The Florida Supreme Court upheld that the legislators could write in the "and" language and that license caps and vertical integration was fair play. In case you were wondering, the judge that made that final decision was Justice Alan Lawson, pictured above. So that's the blueprint. Closed license, vertical integration, and you can't just grow, you can't just sell, you have to do everything. And if that created real competition, well, the numbers would show it, but they don't. The next thing I did was pull the Office of Medical Marijuana Usage, the OMMU, or OMU as I like to call it, and here's some interesting data that I found. In 2023, The top 5 in weekly dispensation by milligrams and flower were, in this order, Trulieve, Air, Curaleaf, Certera, and Move. In 2026, any guesses? The top 5 by milligrams and flower were Trulieve, Curaleaf, Move, Air, and Certera. Slightly different order, same 5 names. Let me paint a clearer picture. Roughly 40% of all new stores were opened by those 5 incumbents I mentioned. In a weekly snapshot, those 5 chains together sold 287 million milligrams of THC in the weeks that I looked at, while the rest of the 16 companies combined sold about 142 million. The top 5 sold double what the rest of the program sold in a single week. The state wrote the rules so that very few licenses would exist and then took years to issue more. And by this point already, once the licenses are finally issued, those top 5 incumbents, as we have seen, have already turned their head start into a huge monopoly, hundreds of retail locations, and patient loyalty. And that is exactly why we've seen no movement at the top across a 3-year time span. Now, let's look to the future. If you are a multi-millionaire whose husband already went to jail for bribery and fraud, what's your next step in the playbook? Oh, let's control things legally. Enter Smart and Safe Florida. Smart and Safe Florida is the political committee behind the Amendment 3 Adult Use Act. Simply put, Smart and Safe writes the rules that go on the ballot. They get the signatures for the ballot. They do the entire ad campaign that gets people to vote for the ballot, and they also squash any opponents that might oppose their ballot. The committee pays for the signature gathering. It keeps the specific legal version of this legalization on the ballot, and it pays for the lawyers who defend it in court. And who exactly is the one bankrolling all of this? Ding, ding, ding. If you guessed Trulieve, you'd be correct. Trulieve poured roughly $145 million to $149 million into the 2024 Smart and Safe campaign alone. When that fell short of the 60% approval rating they needed, they came back in early 2025 with roughly another $19.6 million. Other multi-state operators chipped in, but nowhere near that scale. Here's why Trulieve is really so invested in Florida. And the answer being money is not the shocking thing here, it's how much money it is. Analysts estimate Trulieve controls a huge share of the Florida market. Over a third of all cannabis sales, 40% of flower sales, and a fifth of all dispensaries. Florida's medical market is often valued in the $1.5 to $2 billion range, which means hundreds of millions in annual and state revenue under the current setup. Some modeling and earnings commentary suggests that under a limited license recreational system, Trulieve alone could see Florida revenue jump by over $1 billion a year. While Trulieve is fighting to write the next version of legal weed in Florida, Kim Rivers was in Washington, D.C., helping shape the next version of what federal weed looks like. And that is why the Forbes article matters. Guys, I literally cannot make this up. Kim Rivers, she dropped the spiciest Forbes article. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, I filmed the video you are watching right now before she actually dropped this article. This article is like a heaven sent from God. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Kim, for this. This was so nice of you to just basically confirm everything I was saying and just continuously to publicly gloat about it. This really does show that the rich in our world can do whatever they want, break all the rules that you and me follow, and they can just gloat about it in Forbes. That's kind of what this proves to us. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, on December 5th, 2025, President Donald Trump signed an executive order that told Attorney General Pam Bondi to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1, where it's been sitting next to heroin and LSD since 1970, to Schedule 3, next to Tylenol and codeine. Kim Rivers was in the room when he signed it. She spent 2 years and $750,000 in donations lobbying for this. When Trump signed the order, he gave her the pen and he gave her a red Make America Great Again hat. That hat is signed by Trump with the quote, "Great job, Kim." It is now hanging in the Trulieve headquarters. The same woman whose then boyfriend, now husband, was on FBI tape bragging about helping rig Florida's weed laws, just got the President of the United States to rig federal weed policy. And she got a hat for it. She even met him in Bedminster in August of 2024. The very next day, Trump posted on Truth Social that he was voting yes on Amendment 3. Florida's recreational weed bill, the same one that Kim Rivers spent $165 million on. And here's the part no one's talking about that stops being politics and becomes a heist stealing from you and me. There's a tax code in this country called 288E. If you sell a Schedule 1 drug, which weed has been since the 1970s, you can't deduct your business expenses like a normal company would. No rent, no payroll, no advertising. Effectively, cannabis companies pay a tax rate of over 60%. But Schedule 3 drugs? Rule doesn't apply. So scheduling weed from 1 to 3 saves Trulieve millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. So here's what Trulieve actually did. In 2023, 2 years before Trump signed anything, Trulieve filed amended tax returns with the IRS. They argued 288E shouldn't apply to them, and they asked for a refund. So the IRS sent them a check for $114 million. $114 million. Based on an argument that the law was going to change. It hadn't changed yet. The real fun part is that Trulieve even admits in their own tax filings that if the IRS ever came back and said no, that they would owe $670 million in back taxes. I'll say it again, $670 million in back taxes. So we can effectively say that Kim Rivers is a bit of a gambler because in 2023, she took a $114 million bet against a $670 million loss that the federal weed law was going to change, that she then personally changed and then bragged about it in Forbes. You can't tell me any of that's a coincidence, that's a play, and to her credit, she ran it perfectly. Anyways, I'm just playing Kim Rivers. You know I love you. Okay, so now that you know how the rigging actually happened, here are the 3 ways this actually shows up in your life when you walk into a dispensary. It shows up by the quality of the weed you smoke, the product diversity in the dispensaries we have, and the pricing that seems to stay the same and is the same after nearly 3 years. Let's start with quality and the THC inflation problem. When a small group of companies controls roughly 40% of the cannabis growth and market share, and every step has to be done inside a vertically integrated system, labs aren't competing to be strict and honest, they're competing to keep clients happy. And this isn't me just speculating. Here's some problems that occur in non-limited license markets. A peer-reviewed PLOS1 study bought flower from 10 Colorado dispensaries and retested it in an independent lab. The average measured THC was about 15%, far below the 25 to 30% numbers printed on the label. Roughly 70% of the samples had THC more than 15% lower than the label claimed. In a report done by Leafly, producers admitted sending the same batch to multiple labs and sticking with whichever one printed the highest THC, threatening to walk if numbers drop. And that is how you get shelves full of mid that read consistently 28 to 32%. Next, let's talk about product diversity. And when I say product diversity, what I don't necessarily mean is I want to see a bunch of new strains across new menus. What I'm talking about here is specialization. Specialization does not occur in a market that makes you process, transport, grow, and do everything seed to sale. You're not going to have the best quality experience when it comes to the product. You're not going to have the best experience in the dispensary, and you sure as hell aren't going to have any products that are actually made for medical cannabis patients. Now, let's move on to pricing and where you're probably going to feel this the most. Vertical integration license caps are the perfect way to keep base pricing high. New companies cannot just come in and do a price race to the bottom. They have to spend all of their time building out seed to sale, and that costs money. They cannot pass those savings on to the patient in any quick way once they open, if their license is ever even approved. So while you still see BOGOs, loyalty programs, and all of that crap, baseline pricing stays the same. Even with somewhat affordable eighths, we all know those are the most dog shit tier eighths that the program has to offer, and you're still paying a heavy premium on any kind of product that actually gets you stoned or could compare to a market like California, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and all those Western states. Now, I don't like to do all this complaining without an answer. I'd like to highlight something that I think is honestly a low shot at passing, but what I think would fix this market entirely. And I'd like to shout out Senator Carlos Smith for proposing SB 776 and SB 1398. These measures would not only allow certain patients to grow plants at home bought from dispensaries, but it's an adult use bill that would legalize cannabis for adults 21 and over, allow home grow, break licenses into separate categories, permit wholesale between license types, all of that directly attacking the vertical integration system that we know and love today. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is really the only clear path I see forward. end vertical integration, allow home grow, fix testing and transparency, and stop embedding specific business models into our Constitution. If we do all that, like I said, it's a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, there might be some hope for this program. Now, when we're all dying from this in 20 years of some foreign new type of cancer, just remember, it's Mini Monday.